Hello and welcome back to New Wave, the podcast where we dive into one big question. What's making waves in the European climate tech ecosystem this week? Joining me today on the microphone are three deep tech investors. We have Maxi, investor at HV Capital, Jake, investor at Voyager Ventures, and Jordan, investor at IQ Capital. Today's episode is a bit of a special one. Think of it as a deep tech investing 101. Obviously, deep tech is critical to solving climate change. And so today we use Corintis as a case study. And we talk about how to assess a startup like Corintis. We chat about deep tech valuations and the state of European deep tech. And we also talk about how generalist VCs can make the leap into deep tech investing. Before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or to follow us on Apple Podcast and Spotify. It takes 2 seconds, but really helps the show. New episodes drop every Friday at 9 a.m. CET. All right, let's get into it. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. It's my first kind of deep tech VC panel. I've kind of tried to regroup some of the best deep tech VC I know in my network, or at least were recommended to me. Thank you for taking the time. Today, we'll talk about chips and climate and how that stories come together. Maxi, I'd love for you to get started on this. So there's a startup called Corintis. It's a European startup. They raised quite a bit of money with a very high valuation recently. Can you start with the big picture? Like, how does chips matter for the climate revolution, and how does Corintis fit into that story?
Sure, happy to. And for context, Corintis is a chip cooling startup, and I think there are sort of two angles that are relevant for climate. One is actually in 2023, there was a Sequoia thought paper on AI's $200 billion question. And there was one sentence in that said, for every $1 spent on a GPU, roughly $1 needs to be spent on energy costs to run the GPU in the data center. So there's a very direct link between sort of, more chips, more data centers, and a requirement for more cooling, which is a significant share of OPEX for data centers, right? And then I think there's a second angle going back to 2024 when Nvidia's Jensen at the launch of Blackwell GPUs announced that liquid cooling will be necessary to support more powerful GPUs in the future, right? At that point, I think the first generation is drawing something like 700 watt in power. And with the next generation crossing sort of the 1 kilowatt border, traditional cooling just does not work anymore to cool down those chips. So liquid cooling basically has to be adopted if we want ever more powerful chips is what to take away from the Nvidia announcement. And then before jumping to Corintis, maybe a bit of background on cooling for chips and in data centers. Most legacy data centers use air cooling, right? So basically, fans push chilled air across server racks, and then you have large HVAC units removing the heat from the facility. And that's basically reaching, its limit with ever more powerful GPUs. And then liquid cooling that Jensen was referring to comes basically in two primary forms in data centers. One is, and both use liquid to draw heat away much faster than air can. So one approach is immersion cooling, and in immersion cooling, you can imagine taking an entire server or component and submerging it quite literally in a bath, which has a specially engineered liquid, let's say, to cool the server or the component. And then there's direct-to-chip liquid cooling, which is what Corintis and others are doing. And this is basically focused on you have kind of a closed loop of a liquid that circulates through cold plates attached to a GPU and so directly cools the chip. And then finally on Corintis, for those of you who haven't come across the company, they're chip cooling spin-off from EFPL in Lausanne, and they fit in this direct-to-chip cooling bucket. And basically the innovation here is it's no longer a one-size-fits-all approach, but they have an AI-based optimized microfluid cooling solution that basically means the cooling pattern is linked to the chip design and therefore much more efficient. And then you can do that either as a drop-in replacement, so replacing cold plates that are one-size-fits-all solution, or basically going, even deeper into like co-packaging the cooling with the chip or going into the substrate, which has sort of even greater performance improvements. So hopefully that helps to lay the land a bit.
Yes, for sure. And I think one of the questions I would have to all of you, and maybe Jake, if you want to go next, but I think, Jake, you've looked at the company, and one of the parts of the company that was interesting to me, at least as a aspiring climate VC, is that on their website, they clearly state like enabling the next generation of sustainable computing, which was interesting for me because all of the climate startups today are kind of removing the word climate from their pitch deck. And here we have a company that basically is saying we will improve productivity, if you will, for servers by making them more efficient, but equally keeps the word climate. Jake, when you looked at them, is the team kind of motivated by that sustainability aspect, or is it more sort of just like improving the efficiency of cooling?
I think they are motivated by it. What's really nice about the cooling space in specific is, when you're saving electricity, you're also saving on OpEx. The business case and the climate case really align really well. And, to hyperscalers, that's really important. It's been on their roadmap for many years. Some are scaling back from their climate goals. But in order to be aligned, I think the Corintis team wants to kind of also speak to that side of the business and that side of the organization. There's a number of stakeholders, the large players in the world, Azure and others, who across basically the climate team, the data center architecture team, operations team, and kind of the more pathfinding and next gen compute R&D side, that all have a say. And I think it's a way to win them all. But no, I do think that there's a genuine angle there. And like I mentioned, the overlap is pretty perfect in space.
Well, look, let's get into the name of the game for this episode, which is really to talk about how to invest in these technologies. We understand now that basically there is a climate aspect to it, which is great. We understand the efficiency play for energy. How do we look at such a difficult technology to understand? This is like the deepest science you can imagine almost. Jordan, you're spending your days looking at this type of companies. What do you look for?
Well, first comment would be that it's definitely not the deepest science that I can imagine. It's by no means the deepest science that we see coming across our deck or in our portfolio. But no, I mean but it's pretty. I would describe it. It's less about the science being deep, but actually the challenge of commercialization and integration being difficult and being deep in that sense. So, what I would be thinking about with a company like Corintis is the kind of time, what is your expectation of the time it's going to take for their technology to be integrated into the data center? And how is that going to happen, without getting too close to one of the large kind of hyperscale players. So, as a kind of IC member, those are the kind of questions I would be putting to Maxi. But zooming out, I think it's really about there's a lot of capital expenditure happening right now in data centers. And that's kind of driven by the desire to kind of capture the opportunity that AI presents. And I think when you read a lot of the kind of investment case for these kind of companies, it often kind of assumes that capital expenditure is going to kind of continue or accelerate. So kind of like zooming out for me would also be a question of, is the industry still going to be laying out as much CapEx in 5 to 10 years time when your technology is mature and it's ready to be integrated into the system? Do you zooming out, do you believe that kind of we're still going to be, doubling or tripling the amount of data center compute out there in the world?
And that's a double-edged sword. I think the kind of urgency, the hair on fire problem and demand today, you mentioned down the line, is that going to continue? But in the here and now, when I look at a company, going back to Hugo's original question, since it is such an important problem, cooling, for example, or any way to reduce energy or power usage of the data center, that means if I'm looking at a seed deck or a Series A deck, I do expect some significant conversations, discussions, or even maybe pilots happening with hyperscale customers or their partners. It's just how important and existential is to their own businesses. And so if they're not there, that is one area, Hugo, back to your original question around investing, that is something that really sticks out to me, because it probably should be there. Not always, but probably should be there. So that's the other part of when you have such an interesting or such an important problem. I'm seeing more and more kind of early LOI, I would call it, and not quite pilot because the hardware doesn't exist yet, with even pre-seed customers and the Nvidias of the world.
I think maybe just doubling down on that point, if you think about it as a VC, hyperscalers is a terrible customer base, right? In the sense that they have, killed so many startups and scale-ups, trying to sell into them as the main customer base. So to Jake's point, I think it's pretty easy for, generally speaking, startups getting an LOI or even a small scale pilot if it's a big problem, right? Because the hyperscalers then just throw money at a couple of solutions and see what really works. But then, in the end there can be quite a dependency on say one of them. And it's pretty hard to actually convert that to supply agreements and big volume orders. And they often want to see, a supply chain, a manufacturing setup that can support volumes, which then can be kind of a chicken and egg problem for a startup, because you need to raise money to get up volumes and you need to have the big customer signing up for more volumes to raise money.
And how do you think about customer concentration to that extent? I mean, it's like hyperscalers are 5 companies in the world. So if you can't convince one of them, you don't have a business, really. So how do you think about that?
And it's if you convince one of them only, right, you risk becoming an basically acquisition target, right? Or at least hard to fund the company that, say, has 80-90% of revenues with one hyperscaler. So I think you need to get actually more than one of them. And it can be, as mentioned, quite a long way to actually convert them to proper supply agreements or binding contracts.
Just to build on Maxi's point, I mean, startups are in a tough place right now in this space, because if the hyperscalers aren't doing POCs with you, that's a little bit of a red flag. But also they're kind of doing POCs with everybody. So it's hard to kind of read that demand signal. And as you say, it's, we have definitely kind of passed up the opportunity to invest in some companies because we sort of don't see the credible route to avoiding kind of acquisition, early acquisition by one of the big players. And the question we ask ourselves is, how can we build a big company here? How can we navigate the market dynamics to kind of prevent that from happening, to kind of escape kind of, early acquisition and realize the kind of big vision of the company?
And if we go on that topic, I think one of the questions I would have is, and that's Corintis, but that applies to other startups as well, but they have the CEO of Intel joining the board. I was like, is that an early signal for M&A with Intel at some point? How would you read that in general? The CEO of a big tech company joining the board of a small startup. What's the signal that this sends to the market?
I mean, my personal opinion, I think it's super important in, European semiconductor and chip sort of, startups and scale-ups. We don't have the industry here, right? So a lot of the, say, customer intros and so on, you need someone from the semicon industry with that reputation, and experience. And in Europe, I think we only really have sort of the ASML lithography part of the value chain, and most other things are Taiwan, Asia, and the US, right? So I do think, generally speaking, it's super important to get people who know the industry and, who know sort of the other players involved in startups to scale them out of Europe. And then in this case, I think Corintis also announced, for example, a, project with Microsoft. So I think they are, from what I can see, not trying to get acquired, but actually to work with multiple or most of the large ones.
It's also hopefully have someone, definitely it opens doors, particularly in the US, to Max's point, but that understands the entire value chain. So from micro device all the way through up to rack server level architecture is really important. Obviously, what Corintis is working on is largely a thermodynamics problem. So, many of their engineers, for example, would be thermal engineers, same with fluidics as well. But bringing in someone who knows exactly how the entire process works, going from device all the way into a data center, is definitely helpful, especially when you look at the roadmap and like Maxi discussed in the future, there's opportunities for packaging, co-packaging, substrate, things like this to go further into the chip. That's definitely a specialty that Intel brings to the table, and anyone associated at the highest level of Intel would be best positioned to speak on.
It's maybe just reacting to Jake's comment. I think this discussion of, how far to go into the chip and into this, value chain and ecosystem is a super interesting one that we think about a lot when looking at, startups, whether Corintis or other ones in the space. Because on the one hand, obviously it's hard, right? There's lots of entrenched players and integration, and that will take a lot of time. On the other hand, if you manage to do that and say a cooling solution really becomes embedded sort of in substrate, in big fabs like TSMC and so on, then it becomes also super defensible, right? And maybe a new kind of monopoly kind of player as well. So I think it's a super, super important point.
Absolutely agreed on the defensibility piece. If you're really built into it, especially on kind of the software design that's used to make the cold plates and then all the way through. So basically, anytime they're coming out with the next generation of a chip, they're talking to you well ahead of time before many people even know about it, because they need to design at the same time. Definitely a good point. And then for the kind of who do we sell to and when question is really interesting. Max, you just touched on that. I think, or at least in part, I'm seeing a lot of kind of product roadmaps that maybe have like Gen 1 through 3. And Gen 1 is ready to go, but probably not to the most attractive customer segment for whatever reason, largely kind of engineering challenges just on kind of a few key specs, for example. But then maybe that Gen 1 customer segment isn't the most attractive to raise that Series A or Series B. So do we leapfrog it? Do we try to pull forward proof points otherwise? I'm curious what you two are seeing in the market around that. But that's something I'm starting to see more and more, is like a really compelling Gen 3 product and a little uncertainty of how to get there through 1 and 2.
Yeah, no, super true. Can echo that. I think often maybe in, photonics and other spaces, maybe there's a proof point in, say, the quantum computing market, but not yet for the hyperscaler market, and a pretty big challenge to, I guess, translate proof points from like a beachhead that is small but ready to adopt to sort of the real customer base.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of across the board right now. I think, we're seeing companies where it really makes sense to try to accelerate them as much as possible, or from a third party perspective, it would kind of make sense to try to accelerate as much as possible to that kind of Gen 2, Gen 3 products, because the challenges that they're addressing are so kind of screaming obvious right now, and they may be a little bit late, to kind of the party in that sense. And obviously for investors, that normally means kind of, investing more capital, taking more risk up front to try and accelerate them as quickly as possible. I think to go back to what, you guys just said around, are they a company that's capable of kind of achieving a dominant position in the market? I think you have to kind of, in this space, go back to kind of first principles on the technology and try to kind of assess, are they really delivering a step change in capability? Is this technology, such a strong proposition that it's going to give them, a huge leg up in an otherwise difficult industry? And of course, the people that are involved, the founders, the advisors are important as well. Can't kind of stress that enough. The kind of semiconductor industry is not one that you can kind of easily navigate if you haven't had experience there and you don't have the kind of contact book that you can open up. But it's still a large part based on the kind of technology that you're bringing to market as well.
And I'd love to hear your take on that, Jordan, on the first principles of the technology, because that's the thing that I think most, I would say, VCs that are not former engineers, that don't have that kind of deep tech focus, would have a hard time understanding. So, like, when you start looking at a company like that and looking at the technology, what do you look for exactly? What are the proof points that tells you, okay, this is good tech or this is, crappy technology, right?
I think ideally you already started like 6 months ago or longer. You already started a year ago, kind of developing the prepared mind. So I think something we spend a lot of time doing here at IQ is kind of developing that prepared mind, developing investment theses in different areas, trying to understand the state of the art and the kind of the landscape of the status quo technologies and their capability. Understanding where there are shortcomings and understanding why different technologies are kind of winning out in today's landscape. And that's all done. So, as soon as you do get on a call with that really compelling founder that on the face of it has a really interesting technology, you can as quickly as possible kind of contextualize it and understand it. And, you may be a week's worth of diligence away from having a pretty informed opinion about whether this, how far this moves the needle. And then I can't stress enough that really like a lot of the role of a VC is to just kind of assimilate different people's opinions. So you need a network of trusted advisors in the industry that you're looking at that you can pick up the phone to and talk to about technology and really kind of canvass the opinion of as many people as possible. So it's not something that that prepared mind is not something that you build alone in isolation, just from kind of desk research. You really need to talk to kind of experts in the field. Jake, I don't know if you want to kind of pick up on that or.
100% agree on the last part, especially on hearing it from different people in different regions, getting voice of customer from data center operators, from executives at some of the hyperscalers. How do they think about this is one example class. Not everyone in the world is a hyperscaler, but how do they think about their purchasing decisions? I think even into the Corintis example, even if and it's underway, significant performance improvement is shown. Okay, well, being able to scale up to meet their demand is probably the biggest challenge the company faces, and not actually some of the engineering problems they've solved either in the lab or kind of in the pilot phase. So, how do you go from, 100,000 cold plates to 500,000 cold plates? And then if you want to add another, large customer, to diversify and do it the right way, like Maxi said, so you don't become an acquisition target. Well, okay, now you're looking at, over 1 million cold plates. And then what happens? And how do you service all that? And that's the scale up challenge that, some of these companies that win these contracts, that they face way sooner than they would ever expect. And that's where I think is really interesting. And that's where probably, the next round comes earlier than expected. And, everything starts moving all at once.
And I guess to that extent, how much of a role does the collaboration with Microsoft plays in your investment decision? Like if you're looking at Corintis specifically, and they come in and they say, hey, we have this kind of proof of concept going on with Microsoft. Is that the factor that unlocks the round for you? Or, or is that, how much do you rely on that, I guess, right?
I would want to kind of pick up the phone and speak to these guys at Microsoft that they're working with and understand, what is Microsoft's motivation? How strong is the connection? How critical are they to Microsoft's roadmap? All of these questions, and try and kind of assess, is this a company like Microsoft that's, supporting multiple competing technologies, just wants to get a view across the industry? Or is this more of, the kind of second phase of that where, they've really selected a company and a technology that they think solves a real burning problem for them. So, yeah, I've done that, over the last couple of years, picked up the phone, spoken to a hyperscaler, and, sometimes you find that the answer is, they forgot they've even signed an LOI with the company, through to, yes, this is absolutely core to our roadmap. And, we've got that we're flying them out to West Coast next week, sort of thing.
I think there are two really important pieces in there. One of which, and I would do the same thing, is determining who all Microsoft, in this case, has evaluated. And then also, if there's a compelling kind of status quo or do nothing technology, does that make the most sense? In other words, not making a decision, maybe it's an operational change that's too much, or the non-financial considerations when it comes to switching technologies, to changing a data center's architecture, or how, your racks and servers stack, things like that. And then the other part that Jordan talked about that I think is maybe the most telling when you're on one of these calls is around the roadmap alignment. And the way you can tell they're very serious is trying to get a sense for how much of their time, their engineers' time, and their R&D team's time they're devoting to this. Because if it's significant, there's a significant opportunity cost to Microsoft or other companies. And I think that's probably the most telling, or one of the most telling parts from a customer call like that.
No, I agree. I mean, I think in this case, it was, if I am not mistaken, Satya Nadella, right, the CEO of Microsoft, who shared the announcement sort of on his personal LinkedIn and Outlook. So I think in this case, I would say to, the points Jordan and Jake raised, I wish he would pick up my phone call if I ring him. But I do think that, is signals, quite a level of seriousness if this has sort of reached a C-level of the hyperscalers, as opposed to, as Jordan mentioned, right, maybe someone in the organization who's a researcher who finds this super interesting, signed an LOI, and it's not really aligned, with the business strategy or roadmap as much.
But first principles matter. Hugo and Jordan talked about it earlier. Satya, if I'm not mistaken, launched their Project Silica back in 2018, 2019. There's a picture of him holding a glass kind of cartridge on stage that basically gets laser etched and stores cold data. That project, as of what I understand, a couple months ago, is now all shut down. So the first principle is you can't avoid them, you can't dodge it. At some point, the engineering and the science and the physics wins out, even over the commercial side, even though the commercial side is important. So it is kind of a delicate balance between the two.
Something else about this particular round, but I think it also applies in general to deep tech, which is like, it seems like valuation often are quite high in deep tech, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm looking at like Fusion round, or like this example, apparently the company was valued around 400 million, which, I don't know if it's the right source of truth or not, but in general, it feels like valuations are quite high. How do we think about that as a VC? Because obviously, yes, there is a case that if this company becomes the next like cooling infrastructure for all data centers in the world, then that's of course a massive company. But how do we think about pricing as a deep tech VC in general?
Just the quickest go at it, perhaps, but obviously there's different round names, so it's not always perfectly aligned. But I think that once it becomes a question of scaling, that's when the valuation inflection can really jump. I think in some of the deep tech spaces, especially within semiconductors, seeing that valuation inflection is actually a little bit later than you might otherwise expect. And maybe that's not a perfect story here that fits with Corintis, but you raise at, relatively modest markups until you have, your full breakthrough on the commercialization side, which is usually some sort of PO with a large player or a set of large players in your pipeline. And then from there, it's a manufacturing and scale up problem. And I think that's where, some of the larger rounds that go towards, perhaps CapEx charges around manufacturing, things like that are warranted. And that's where, of course, as a result of having a bigger round and having proven out the tech and making it more of a scaling problem, that you'll see the valuations really start to jump.
I mean, I guess I agree with the statement that valuations are high currently for AI and certain pockets of deep tech, right? I think what we are seeing is anything related to this European sovereignty resilience. We only invest in Europe, is pretty hype, whether that's, chips and the semicon value chain or certain materials and so on. And then as mentioned, as AI as well. And I think the question is also what size of outcome you need to underwrite, right? For the maths to still make sense. If we get in on a high valuation, that might mean in some cases you need to believe in an exit that's 10 billion or 100 billion to make the maths work. And I think what's encouraging is that we are seeing a couple of, at least acquisition exits in Europe currently that are multiple, in the billions, which might suggest that, those outcomes are are possible in Europe, increasingly so.
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents on kind of round sizes and valuations. I think this is a kind of a bigger issue, a broader issue than just kind of in the AI space and the computing space. Deep tech and hard tech companies just need to raise more capital over their lifetimes to kind of achieve the vision that they set out. They often need to raise more money up front. In Europe, we're very used to kind of drip feeding capital in based on milestones. And you kind of achieve something after 5 years that you might have been able to do in 2. If you'd have kind of capitalized the company properly up front, given them the kind of time and flexibility to, execute on their roadmap, and put them on the map for kind of, to be able to kind of hire the best talent and attract, tier 1 investors at the next round. So I think it's all a matter of, Europe's getting more confident. The deep tech funds are getting more experience, more kind of, confident brains to invest bigger rounds and earlier in the space. And valuations are just a function of that. As a fund, you don't want to be too aggressive up front because you want to make the capital story for the company over the next kind of 3, 4, 5 rounds make sense. And if you're kind of too aggressive early on, you just risk kind of a recap at the next round or the Series B or whatever it is. So I think we spend a lot of time looking at what's the ideal trajectory and capital story for this company. How can we, do we have the confidence in the team that these are the guys that we want to kind of back to take that path? And if so, how much money do they need up front? What's the kind of optimal round size? And the valuation just kind of falls out of that. So I think that's kind of what's happening across the board. And also, frankly, these days, a bigger seed round in Europe puts you on the map for US investors. And there's absolutely an element of that, right? We've been in conversations with other funds when we're syndicating, where people say, why don't we just do an extra 1 or 2 million to round it up to a nice round $10 billion? Because that would get funds and the ecosystem talking on the West Coast. So, that's a not to be kind of underestimated aspect of kind of raising a big kind of splashy round.
Talking about Europe versus the US, I think something interesting with that company, and I think that's across Europe, we have so many talents, great universities, great research centers as well. When we think about, the rise of Europe in the startup ecosystem, do we think that deep tech is better positioned than the traditional, if you will, software startups in, building those large companies and global leaders?
Yes.
Yes. Simple.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could probably talk for about an hour on this subject, but we believe that the next wave of billion euro or 10 billion euro valuation companies are going to be deep tech. There is a fundamental shift happening away from software towards hardware. In a large part, it's actually being driven by AI and the kind of implications of AI and people thinking about how that will kind of commoditize software in the future. So, you've got deep tech funds that have been investing in this space for a while. And then you've got kind of more and more generalist funds that are coming to deep tech looking for kind of defensibility and looking for the next kind of, unicorn and decacorn companies that are going to be built over the next, 10, 20 years. So, yeah, I mean, that's our thesis. That's why we exist. So a resounding yes from IQ Capital.
I mean, from HV, since we're, more of a generalist fund that, has pushed into deep tech and is really active, I think I generally agree, right? We've been investing in the consumer e-commerce wave starting 25 years ago, then into the software wave, right, which is the second wave. And then we talk about deep tech as sort of the third wave. And we made our first investments 5-6 years ago. I think ESA Aerospace is actually our first one. That's squarely a deep tech company. I think maybe, and I agree with the talent and IP, I think the one thing that's missing, and we would love to, or I would love to see more in Europe, is growth funding, right? We are multi-stage investors, so we can write first tickets up to 50 million. And I think what we see that if you are European deep tech startup scale up, right, and you grow and you grow and you need more capital, you basically have to get it either from public funding, right, which is great, but also, maybe a bit slower, there's some strings attached, etc., or you have to go to the US to raise private funding at some point. So I think more, sort of growth scale capital that is flexible and emphasizes speed and so on, is something that would help, turn those great foundations into more, I guess, like decacorn outcomes and so on in Europe.
And values companies like that through a deep tech lens.
Yeah. Jake, what's your opinion? Because you're sitting in the US right now, so really interesting to get your perspective as well.
Well, I think the European ecosystem, and especially the Swiss ecosystem for a company like this, can definitely foster deep tech in a way that maybe it can't do the same for software, or maybe that it's a little bit more uniquely positioned. I think obviously excellent R&D institutions, universities, and then you have the manufacturing base, which is pretty integrated, maybe a couple key missing parts or supply lines, but for the most part, your manufacturing partner ecosystem are all in continental Europe more broadly. And then, finally, government buy-in as well, which is pretty critical, just to do everything you can to help at the very early stages in terms of grants, which is very common, but also in terms of kind of matching labor costs, things like that. So I've definitely been impressed with the ability for these pre-seed seed stage maybe companies in Europe in these deep tech sectors to be able to make really fast progress on the R&D side and do it on a pretty small budget, especially compared to maybe a comparable company in the US. Although I think the key consideration there is, like Maxi and Jordan alluded to, there might be more funds at least at the growth stage to be able to warrant those higher budgets. So I think they're definitely equally impressive and efficient in terms of their R&D spend.
For someone that's looking to do some more kind of deep tech investments that's not used to it, like what would be the first kind of starting points when looking at some, shifting away, I guess, from software into deep tech? Like what are the few things that you would recommend investors to look at?
I mean, maybe as a generalist fund, right? I think one thing to figure out is you're new in deep tech, you're trying to get into it, right? So you have limited time to develop a prepared mind on everything, right? So I think what we do quite a bit is thinking about market timing and sort of opportunity. Ideally, you want to invest in things before it's obvious, but not too early. So I think maybe one suggestion is think about, what are sort of the things in deep tech that you think will happen, like be adopted in the market the next couple of years, and then start with a couple of, topics to really deep dive on and develop that prepared mind that Jordan mentioned.
For me, having been a former software investor myself in the growth stage, I think probably the most valuable thing you could do if you're going from generalist maybe to more deep tech investing is really start paying attention to the techno-economic models. I think that's something that's obviously in every deep tech data room that might not be there for a software company or other type of company. But once you really start to break those down, you'll obviously see the pattern. You'll start to prepare the mind on kind of how these businesses scale, everything from input costs to intermediate costs, labor, R&D, CapEx, and the manufacturing side all the way through. So I think that's something that's probably the best bridge for someone who's maybe more generalist or software investor to get into deep tech and try to understand how these businesses go from pretty small on paper to pretty large on paper very fast in terms of their growth goals. And it's all in that techno-economic model. And that's also, encompasses kind of the part of the why we win story as well.
I don't disagree with anything Maxi or Jake said, but maybe just to pick up from another angle as well. If you're a generalist investor wanting to get more into deep tech, you've got to kind of know your stuff. You've got to be kind of credible when you get on a call with these guys. Because they're going to sniff you out, and if your kind of subject matter knowledge is as deep as a kind of ChatGPT prompt that you've done like 10 minutes before the call, they're going to figure that out, and they're not going to kind of trust that you understand them or their business, and critically like how they're not going to trust that you're going to be able to represent them well in the market when you have to go and like help with the next funding round and you're out in the market talking about their technology and their company. So I would say like, obviously it's a big ask to do this for kind of multiple sectors, but you really need to kind of, get embedded in a sector, spend time there, speak to other investors, speak to founders, look at what other people are investing in, read up on the real issues in a lot of these industries and sectors, and just try to kind of build that kind of broad background knowledge, so that when you jump on a call, you can, you come across as credible, and you can kind of, build a good relationship with the founders right off the bat.
Love that. Well, hopefully this episode serves a little bit as a deep tech 101 and explored a few different topics that is important for deep tech investors. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining me today. That was really insightful, at least for me. I hope people will enjoy it as well. And then looking forward to chat with you all the next time.
Amazing. Thanks for hosting.
Awesome. Thank you.